Answer me now. Did you betray your oath?
I kept my oath on the battlefield, but it's here, in this courtroom, that I must fight to defend my dignity.
Judge orders disabled veteran to stand during sentencing. Next moment leaves the court in tears. The gavel echoed through the Louisville courthouse as Judge Edward Lawson's cold command cut through the morning air like a blade. Stand when addressing this court, Mr. Reed. But Marcus Reed could only point to his wheelchair and whisper the words that would soon bring an entire courtroom to tears. Your Honor, I can't. In moments, a figure from the judge's own past would walk through those doors and change everything. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood as a monument to Southern justice, its limestone columns reaching toward the Kentucky sky, like fingers grasping for moral authority that seemed increasingly elusive with each passing case. The building's interior reflected decades of legal proceedings, with worn marble floors that had witnessed countless moments of triumph and tragedy, and courtrooms designed to intimidate rather than comfort those seeking justice. On this humid June morning in 2025, the air conditioning struggled against the oppressive heat, creating an atmosphere that felt as stifling as the proceedings about to unfold within its walls. Marcus Reed sat in his wheelchair before the defendant's table, his 34-year-old frame carrying the invisible weight of service sacrifice and a society that seemed determined to forget both. The former Air Force Staff Sergeant's dark skin showed the stress lines that came from years of fighting battles both overseas and at home, while his carefully pressed clothes spoke of someone who understood the importance of maintaining dignity even when the world seemed intent on stripping it away. The chrome wheels of his chair caught the fluorescent lighting, creating small reflections that danced across the courtroom floor like fragments of hope in an otherwise dim environment. The charges against Marcus stem from an incident at Cherokee Park 3 weeks earlier, where he had allegedly disturbed the peace during what police reports described as an aggressive confrontation with a group of teenagers. The official narrative painted a picture of a volatile veteran who had lost control in a public space, shouting at young people and creating a disturbance that required police intervention. But like so many official narratives involving veterans with invisible wounds, this one failed to capture the full context of events that had led to Marcus finding himself in this courtroom. Judge Edward Lawson presided over the proceedings with the kind of rigid authority that had made him both respected and feared throughout Kentucky's legal community. At 60 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades on the bench, building a reputation for harsh sentences and zero tolerance for what he considered excuses or emotional appeals. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his black robes immaculate, and his demeanor suggested someone who viewed his courtroom as a stage where he was both director and starring performer. The local bar association respected his efficiency, but few understood the personal experiences that had shaped his often unforgiving approach to justice. The incident that had brought Marcus to this courtroom began on a peaceful afternoon when he had been visiting Cherokee Park to practice his physical therapy exercises on the accessible walking trails. As a double amputee who had lost both legs below the knee in a training aircraft crash at Randolph Air Force Base, Marcus relied on these outdoor sessions to maintain his physical conditioning and mental health. The park had become his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the 4 walls of his small apartment and feel connected to the world beyond his disability. It was during one of these sessions that Marcus had witnessed 3 teenagers systematically harassing an elderly homeless man who had been resting on a park bench. The teenagers had been throwing trash at the man, calling him names, and had escalated to physical intimidation when Marcus had intervened. His military training and inherent sense of justice had made it impossible for him to ignore the situation, even though his physical limitations meant that any confrontation would put him at a significant disadvantage. The altercation that followed had been brief but intense, with Marcus using his voice and his moral authority to drive off the teenagers before they could seriously harm the homeless man. But by the time police arrived responding to a call from someone who had witnessed only the final moments of the confrontation, the teenagers had fled, leaving Marcus to face questions about his aggressive behavior and apparent instability. When the sentencing hearing began, Marcus attempted to explain his actions, his voice trembling with emotion, as he described not just the events in the park, but the experiences that had shaped his response to injustice. He spoke about his 8 years of military service, his dedication to the Air Force's core values of integrity, service, and excellence, and the training crash that had ended his career and changed his life forever. Your Honor, I saw someone being hurt, and I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Marcus said, his words coming in halting sentences as he struggled to maintain his composure. In the military, we're taught that you never leave anyone behind, that you stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. That's all I was trying to do in that park. As Marcus continued his testimony describing how the incident had triggered memories of his own vulnerability and the helplessness he had felt during his recovery from the crash, his voice broke with emotion. The vulnerability he displayed was raw and genuine, the kind of honest humanity that should have evoked compassion from anyone who witnessed it. Instead, Judge Lawson's response was a sharp command that silenced the courtroom and exposed the depth of his insensitivity to the veteran's condition. "Stand when addressing this court, Mr. Reed." He ordered, his voice carrying the kind of imperious authority that brooked no argument or discussion. The silence that followed was deafening as every person in the courtroom turned to stare at Marcus, who looked down at his wheelchair and then back at the judge with an expression of disbelief and humiliation. "Your Honor, I cannot," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning system. Judge Lawson's response revealed the depth of his callousness and his complete failure to understand the reality of Marcus's situation. "Don't make excuses, Mr. Reed. Stand up when you're being sentenced." He repeated, his tone suggesting that he believed Marcus was simply being defiant or disrespectful rather than physically incapable of complying with his order. The scattered laughter that rippled through parts of the gallery felt like salt in an open wound, while the uncomfortable shifting and whispered conversations revealed that many observers understood the cruelty of what they were witnessing. Marcus lowered his head in shame, the humiliation washing over him like a physical blow that seemed to drain whatever dignity he had managed to maintain throughout the legal proceedings. Clara Hamilton observed the proceedings from her seat in the gallery with growing horror and determination. At 72 years old, the retired military liaison had spent 4 decades helping service members navigate the transition to civilian life, and she had never witnessed such a blatant display of ignorance and cruelty toward a disabled veteran. She had come to the courthouse that morning at the request of a friend from the local veterans support group, expecting to provide moral support for a struggling former service member. Instead, she found herself witnessing an abuse of judicial power that demanded immediate intervention. Clara's distinguished career had been built on understanding the unique challenges faced by military personnel and veterans, particularly those dealing with combat-related injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder. Her network of contacts throughout the military and Veterans Affairs communities had made her a powerful advocate for those who had served their country, and her reputation for taking on seemingly impossible cases had made her a legend among Kentucky's veteran community. When the court recessed for lunch, Clara approached Marcus in the hallway outside the courtroom, her presence commanding despite her age and diminutive stature. "Mr. Reed, I'm Clara Hamilton," she said, extending her hand with the kind of firm handshake that immediately communicated strength and reliability. "What just happened in there was wrong, and I'm here to help make sure it doesn't happen again." Marcus looked up at her with eyes that held more despair than hope. The morning's humiliation having reinforced his belief that the system he had once served was now actively working against him. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but there's nothing anyone can do," he said quietly. "I just want to accept whatever sentence he gives me and try to move on with my life." Clara's expression softened as she recognized the defeated tone in Marcus's voice, the same hopelessness she had heard from countless veterans over the years who had been ground down by a system that seemed designed to punish rather than support those who had sacrificed for their country. "Son, you didn't lose your legs so that some ignorant judge could humiliate you in his courtroom," she said gently. "You served your country with honor, and you deserve better than this." The investigation that Clara launched into Marcus's case revealed layers of heroism and sacrifice that had been completely ignored by both the prosecution and Marcus's overworked public defender. Military records showed that Marcus had been decorated with the Air Force Commendation Medal for his actions during the training crash that had cost him his legs, having successfully evacuated 3 fellow airmen from the burning aircraft before sustaining his own injuries. The crash had occurred during a routine training flight at Randolph Air Force Base when a mechanical failure had forced an emergency landing that went catastrophically wrong. Marcus, serving as the aircraft's loadmaster, had remained conscious despite his injuries and had organized the evacuation of his crewmates, ensuring that they escaped before the aircraft's fuel tanks exploded. His actions had saved 3 lives, but the cost had been the loss of both his legs and the end of his military career. Clara's investigation also revealed that the video of the park incident that had been circulating on social media had been heavily edited to remove the crucial context that explained Marcus's actions. Through her contacts in the veterans community, she was able to locate Sarah Mitchell, a former Air Force colleague of Marcus, who had witnessed the incident and had recorded it on her phone from a different angle. Sarah's video told a completely different story from the one that had been presented in court. It clearly showed the 3 teenagers systematically harassing the homeless man, escalating from verbal abuse to physical intimidation before Marcus had intervened. The footage revealed that Marcus had attempted to de-escalate the situation through conversation before raising his voice, and that his intervention had prevented what appeared to be an imminent assault on a vulnerable individual. But perhaps more importantly, Clara's investigation revealed information about Judge Lawson's background that provided crucial context for his treatment of Marcus. Through her network of contacts in the military community, she discovered that Lawson had served briefly in the Air Force during the early 1980s, working as a legal clerk at Lackland Air Force Base before transitioning to civilian law school and eventually to the bench. The judge's military service had been brief and unremarkable, but it had exposed him to the realities of military life and the challenges faced by service members dealing with various forms of trauma and injury. More significantly, Clara discovered that Lawson had witnessed firsthand the struggles of veterans with PTSD and physical disabilities during his time at Lackland, making his current treatment of Marcus appear not as ignorance, but as willful cruelty. Armed with this information, Clara began preparing a strategy that would not only vindicate Marcus, but also expose the systematic bias that had led to his persecution. She reached out to her network of contacts in the military community, including former officers who could testify to Marcus's character and service record. But her most important call was to Colonel Helen Carter, Marcus's former commanding officer, who had personally recommended him for his commendation and had maintained contact with him throughout his recovery. Colonel Carter, now 67 and serving in various advisory roles within the Air Force's Veterans Affairs programs, remembered Marcus as one of the finest airmen she had ever commanded. When Clara explained the situation, the colonel's response was immediate and unequivocal. She would travel to Louisville to testify on Marcus's behalf, and she would bring with her the kind of moral authority that could not be dismissed or ignored. The preparation for the final sentencing hearing required careful coordination between Clara, Colonel Carter, and the growing network of supporters who had rallied around Marcus's case. The local veterans community had been mobilized by social media posts about the case, with many former service members recognizing their own struggles in Marcus's story and understanding that the outcome would set a precedent for how disabled veterans were treated by the justice system. Marcus himself had begun to change during the weeks leading up to the final hearing. The support he had received from Clara and the veterans community had begun to restore his sense of self-worth, reminding him that he was more than the sum of his injuries and struggles. He had started attending support group meetings at the local Veterans Center, where he found others who understood his experiences and could offer practical advice for managing both his physical limitations and his PTSD symptoms. But Clara had one more surprise in store for the final hearing, something that she had discovered during her research into Judge Lawson's military background. The judge's harsh treatment of veterans was not random cruelty, but something more personal, rooted in his own experiences as a young airman who had witnessed the struggles of his fellow service members and had somehow learned the wrong lessons from those observations. The revelation of Judge Lawson's military service had been carefully omitted from his official biographies and judicial profiles, mentioned only in passing in old newspaper articles from his early days as a prosecutor. But Clara's research had uncovered the truth. Lawson had served at a time when PTSD was poorly understood and stigmatized, when disabled veterans were often dismissed as damaged goods rather than honored for their sacrifices. The final sentencing hearing began with Judge Lawson displaying the same dismissive attitude that had characterized the earlier proceedings. He clearly expected a quick resolution to the case, with Marcus accepting his sentence and allowing everyone to move on without further drama. The courtroom was packed with supporters, including dozens of veterans who had come to show solidarity with Marcus. But Lawson seemed oblivious to the significance of their presence. As Judge Lawson prepared to deliver what he announced would be a 6-month supervised probation sentence, accompanied by mandatory anger management counseling, Marcus made one final attempt to explain his actions. "Your Honor, I just wanted to help that homeless man the same way I once helped my fellow airmen," he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found his purpose again. "Everything I did was about protecting someone who couldn't protect himself." Lawson's response was predictably harsh and dismissive. "Save the dramatics for someone who might be impressed by them." "Mr. Reed," he said with a wave of his hand that seemed designed to sweep away any consideration of Marcus's motivations or character, "your military service doesn't give you the right to disturb the peace or intimidate civilians." It was at that moment that the courtroom doors opened with a force that commanded everyone's attention, and Colonel Helen Carter entered with the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room simply through the authority of her bearing. Dressed in her military dress uniform with ribbons and decorations that spoke to a lifetime of distinguished service, Carter walked down the center aisle with purpose and dignity that made every person present understand that something significant was about to occur. "Your Honor, I request permission to address the court on behalf of Staff Sergeant Reed," Colonel Carter said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command responsibility and moral leadership. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as everyone waited to see how Judge Lawson would respond to this unexpected development. Colonel Carter's testimony transformed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. Speaking with the precision and passion of a career military officer, she described Marcus's service record in detail, painting a picture of heroism and sacrifice that stood in stark contrast to the criminal narrative that had been constructed around the park incident. She presented evidence of Marcus's commendation citation, reading aloud the specific actions that had earned him recognition for valor and selflessness. Staff Sergeant Reed risked his own life to save 3 of his fellow airmen during an aircraft emergency. Carter testified, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. He displayed the kind of courage and selflessness that defines the very best of American military service. "The man before you is not a criminal or a troublemaker. He is a hero who has been failed by the very system he sacrificed so much to protect." But it was Carter's direct address to Judge Lawson that provided the moment of truth that changed everything. Looking directly at the judge, her voice took on a tone of personal recognition and challenge that cut through his judicial authority like a sword through paper. "Edward, I remember you from your time at Lackland Air Force Base. You worked in the legal office, and you saw firsthand what our wounded warriors go through when they come home. You know what PTSD looks like, and you know what it means to struggle with invisible wounds. How can you sit in judgment of this man when you know exactly what he's going through?" The revelation that Judge Lawson was a fellow veteran sent shockwaves through the courtroom that were visible in the gasps and murmurs that arose from the gallery. Most people present had no idea about the judge's military service, which he had carefully concealed throughout his legal career, out of concern that it might be seen as a weakness or liability in the conservative legal community where he had built his reputation. Lawson's face went pale as Carter continued her testimony, describing how the judge had once witnessed the struggles of disabled veterans at Lackland and had seen the kind of institutional discrimination that could destroy lives and spirits. The parallel between his position as a witness to injustice then and his role as a perpetrator of injustice now was unmistakable, and his harsh treatment of Marcus suddenly appeared not as professional detachment, but as personal betrayal of his own stated values. The moment of truth came when Carter played Sarah's complete video of the park incident, showing clearly that Marcus had acted to protect a vulnerable person from harassment and potential assault rather than committing an unprovoked disturbance. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but more importantly, it was presented in a context that made Marcus's actions appear heroic rather than criminal. As the video played, showing Marcus's patient attempts to reason with the teenagers before his voice rose in defense of the homeless man. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause that seemed to go on forever. Even some of the court personnel who had witnessed Judge Lawson's treatment of Marcus during the earlier hearing seemed moved by the evidence of the veteran's true character and motivations. But the most powerful moment came when Colonel Carter walked over to Marcus's wheelchair and took his hand, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the young man she had once commanded and who had proven himself worthy of every bit of faith she had placed in him. "You are my hero, Marcus," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Then now and always." Marcus's response was equally emotional as he reached up to embrace his former commanding officer, his own tears flowing freely as he experienced the validation and recognition that had been denied to him for so long. The sight of the decorated colonel and the disabled veteran embracing in front of the entire courtroom created a moment of such raw emotion that there was hardly a dry eye in the house. Judge Lawson sat in stunned silence as the applause died down, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to process what had just occurred. The exposure of his own military service and his failure to honor the lessons he should have learned during that service had stripped away his ability to hide behind judicial authority, forcing him to confront the cruelty and hypocrisy of his treatment of Marcus. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and profound. What had begun as a sentencing hearing designed to punish a troubled veteran had become a moment of healing and recognition that touched everyone present. Marcus's vindication was complete, but more importantly, it had been achieved in a way that created lasting change rather than simply resolving a single case. Judge Lawson's final ruling came after several minutes of visible internal struggle, his voice shaking with emotion as he struggled to find words adequate to express his remorse and recognition of his failures. "Mr. Reed, I owe you an apology that no amount of words can adequately convey," he said, his judicial authority replaced by human humility. "Your service to our country deserves honor, not humiliation, and I have failed you in the most fundamental way possible." With trembling hands, he struck his gavel and dismissed all charges against Marcus, issuing a formal apology that acknowledged both the veteran's service and his own failures as a judge. The courtroom erupted in applause once again, but this time it was accompanied by tears of joy and relief from people who had witnessed not just justice being served, but a moment of genuine human redemption. The aftermath of the hearing created ripple effects that extended far beyond Marcus's individual case. Judge Lawson's public acknowledgement of his own military service and his commitment to better understanding the challenges faced by disabled veterans created a powerful example for other judges and legal professionals who had been blind to the unique circumstances of those who had served their country. Clara Hamilton's role in orchestrating Marcus's vindication led to her establishment of a new advocacy organization specifically focused on legal rights for disabled veterans. Her network of contacts and her reputation for taking on impossible cases made her a powerful voice for those who had been failed by the system they had once served to protect. Colonel Carter's intervention in the case had reminded everyone present of the bonds that connected military service members across generations and conflicts, and her willingness to stand up for Marcus demonstrated the kind of leadership and loyalty that defined the military community at its best. For Marcus himself, the experience had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond his legal vindication. The support he had received from the veterans community had helped him reconnect with his sense of purpose and belonging, while the public recognition of his military service and his actions in the park had restored his damaged self-esteem and given him hope for the future. 6 months after the hearing, Marcus had found new purpose as a counselor at the local Veterans Center, where his own experiences with disability and legal challenges made him uniquely qualified to help others facing similar struggles. His story had become an inspiration to other veterans who felt abandoned by the system they had served, proving that justice was possible even when it seemed hopeless. Judge Lawson had undergone his own transformation, seeking education about disability rights and veterans' issues while working to change the way his court handled cases involving former service members. His experience with Marcus had forced him to confront his own prejudices and had ultimately made him a more compassionate and effective judge. On a warm autumn evening, as Marcus led a support group meeting at the Veterans Center, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from despair to hope, from humiliation to honor. The courtroom that had once been a place of shame had become the site of his redemption, and the judge who had ordered him to stand had ultimately helped him find the strength to stand up for others. Clara Hamilton, now in her 70s but showing no signs of slowing down, continued to fight for veterans' rights with the same passion that had defined her entire career. Her intervention in Marcus's case had reminded her of why she had dedicated her life to service, and she approached each new case with renewed energy and purpose. The lesson of Marcus's story, that dignity could be restored even after the most profound humiliation, had spread throughout the veterans community and beyond. It served as a reminder that courage could take many forms, from the battlefield heroism that had earned Marcus his commendation to the moral courage that had driven Clara to take on his case when everyone else had given up. The judge who had once ordered a disabled veteran to stand had learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in a courtroom came not from displays of authority, but from acts of humility and recognition that acknowledged the shared humanity and service of all those who appeared before the bench seeking justice. In the end, the tears that had filled the courtroom that day had washed away years of pain and prejudice, replacing them with understanding compassion and a renewed commitment to ensuring that those who had sacrificed for their country would never again be abandoned by the system they had sworn to protect and defend.